Before the giants existed, before the Watchers descended, there was already contaminated blood on the earth. No one talks about what really happened before Genesis 6, because the truth it hides is deeply uncomfortable. The story of the Nephilim did not begin with the fallen angels. It began with the first murderer in the history of humanity. Cain was not simply a bad man. He was something the world had never seen before and should never have existed at all. The Targum Pseudo-Jonathan, one of the oldest rabbinic texts, states something that the Bible never openly declares. According to that text, Eve did not conceive Cain with Adam, but with Samael, the angel of destruction and eternal death. If that is true, the first being born on earth was not human. It was already a hybrid between two completely different worlds. And God knew when Cain killed Abel, he did not destroy him. He marked him with a visible sign and let him continue living. Why would a just God protect the first murderer in history with a sign warning everyone not to touch him? The answer that the texts suggest is disturbing, because Cain was not like the others, and his lineage had a purpose. The mark of Cain was not spiritual or metaphorical. Ancient rabbinical traditions say it was a physical and visible mark, a hereditary brand passed down from generation to generation that physically distinguished its bearers from others. They were not cursed in a purely moral sense. They were biologically different from all of humanity descended from Seth. And while the line of Seth lived as nomadic shepherds without great ambitions, the line of Cain built something completely different. Genesis 4:17 says that Cain, the exiled one, the murderer, the marked one, founded a city and named it after his own son. A cursed man, cast out from the presence of God, builds the first city in human history that has been recorded. With what knowledge did he build that city? With what capacity? Where did that skill come from that the sons of Seth did not have? Tubal-Cain, his direct descendant, appears in Genesis as the inventor of bronze and iron weapons. And in the book of Enoch, Azazel teaches humans exactly the same thing that Tubal-Cain already knew and mastered beforehand. The unasked question is, did Tubal-Cain learn from Azazel, or did he already know due to his bloodline's legacy? Jubal, also a direct descendant of Cain, invented music and instruments. The cursed forged the culture of. The line of Cain was not the line of failure. It was the line of power, knowledge, and the most advanced civilization. While the sons of Seth prayed and called upon the name of God, the sons of Cain built, invented, and dominated the earth. And when Genesis 6 says that the Watchers saw the daughters of men and took them, it was not something completely. Rabbinic tradition is almost unanimous on this point. The daughters of men mentioned in the text were from the line of Cain. The Watchers did not choose women at random. They were specifically looking for those who already carried hybrid blood within them. What those unions produced was not simply giants, it was the maximum concentration of something that had been building up. Cain was the first step of that process. The Watchers took the second. The Nephilim were the final result. Those giants that dominated the earth did not arise from nothing. They were the direct heirs of a lineage that began with one. The Book of Enoch describes the Nephilim devouring everything that existed on earth with complete voracity. First, they devoured the food, then the animals, after that the humans, and finally, they consumed each other. It was not just evil. It was the ultimate manifestation of a nature biologically incompatible with its surrounding world. Their bodies were too large, their needs impossible to satisfy, and their very existence was profoundly troubling. The Book of Enoch states it with a clarity that few modern translations preserve. They were hybrids with no place in any world. When a Nephilim died, their spirit could neither ascend like that of the angels, nor descend to Sheol like that of humans. They were trapped in this world like bodiless spirits, aimlessly wandering forever through the land that confined them. But before discussing the end of the Nephilim, it is necessary to understand what exactly God decided when he determined what it was. Genesis 6:5 says that God saw that the wickedness of man was great, and that every intent of his heart was only evil. What that verse describes is not ordinary moral wickedness. It is the clinical description of a fundamentally flawed nature. They were not humans who sinned freely. They were beings whose own inner constitution pushed them towards destruction without. And God made the most radical decision that the texts record: to erase from the face of the earth what he had allowed. The flood was not an improvised response to general wickedness. It was the deliberate closure of a process that began with Cain. Noah was the only one whose lineage had remained untainted since Adam. The texts call him perfect in his. Kamim in his generations says the original Hebrew, perfect in his generations, not only in his morality but in the purity of his. That genetic perfection was what set him apart from everyone else and made him the only possible candidate to survive. But Noah had 3 sons with their respective wives, and none of those women received that same sacred description of. Some ancient traditions suggest that at least one of those women carried in her own blood the hidden lineage of Cain. The flood destroyed the bodies of the Nephilim, but their genes, dormant like seeds underground, entered hidden within it. And that's why, when the waters receded and the world began anew, the giants reappeared for generations. Numbers 13:33 states plainly that Moses' spies found Nephilim dwelling in Canaan centuries after the Great. They were neither ghosts nor metaphors. They were physical and real beings who had survived because the lineage of Cain had persisted. And Canaan, the territory where those giants reappear, is not a geographical coincidence that can be easily ignored. Canaan was the son of Ham, son of Noah. The curse that fell upon him points directly to something that the text does not explain. The curse that Noah pronounced on Canaan in Genesis 9 takes on a different meaning when you know the origin of this lineage. It was not just a moral or political curse. It was the recognition that something that should have died was still alive within. The giants of Canaan, the Rephaim, the Anakim, Goliath among them, were the last visible chapter of a very ancient story. David was not simply killing an enemy soldier when he threw that stone with his sling at the Philistine giant. I was closing a cycle that had begun generations ago, when Cain was marked and left alive on this earth. The cursed lineage, the first hybrid in history, the spiritual and biological father of the Nephilim, was meeting its end with. But the physical end of the giants was not the end of everything, because the Book of Enoch clearly speaks of what remains after that. The spirits of the Nephilim, those beings trapped between 2 worlds, have no expiration date in any ancient text. The Book of Enoch explicitly states that those spirits will remain on earth, causing harm until the day of judgment. They are neither fallen angels nor demons created as such. They are the souls of the children of Cain, amplified by blood. If the texts are correct, those spirits remain here, invisible and bodiless, waiting for a judgment that hasn't arrived yet. But there is something more in this story that most who tell it prefer to ignore, because it changes too many things. If Cain was the first hybrid, if his lineage was the one that attracted the Watchers, then original sin has another. It was not just the disobedience of Adam and Eve in the garden. It was the infiltration of a strange nature from the very beginning. Samael did not wait for the Watchers to descend to Mount Hermon to contaminate creation. He did it from the very first. And God, who saw everything, allowed Cain to live, for his lineage to prosper, for him to attract the Watchers, and for them to be born. The most difficult theological question of this whole account is not why the Nephilim existed. It is why God allowed it. The Book of Enoch suggests that without total corruption, the flood wouldn't have necessitated a restart. The flood was not a punishment. It was a cosmic surgery to remove something that had been implanted in creation since then. But like all late surgeries, it could not completely remove what had already penetrated too deeply into the body. The genes of Cain entered the ark. The spirits of his descendants remained free on the earth. The cycle never. And that explains something that Bible readers rarely take the time to consider with the depth it truly deserves. Why did Israel have to fight repeatedly against peoples of extraordinary stature in the land that God had given them? Why was Canaan specifically inhabited by beings that the spies themselves describe as terrifying? Why did the conquest of the Promised Land necessarily involve the total extermination of certain peoples without exception? The texts do not say it explicitly, but the logic that emerges from reading Genesis alongside the Book of Enoch does. It was not an ordinary territorial conquest. It was the second part of what the flood had begun and had not been able to finish. God had given Noah a second chance for pure creation, but the seed of Cain had traveled within it. And now, generations later, that seed had blossomed again in the valleys and mountains of a land that was meant to be. Israel was not just a chosen people to inherit a geographical region. It was the instrument of a cleansing that came from. Each battle against the giants of Canaan was a direct echo of what God had tried to do with the waters. And in every victory of Israel over those peoples, what was being closed was not just a war. It was a chapter of the narrative. The day David set his foot on the fallen body of Goliath, something that had begun with Cain finally reached its point of. But even that breaking point was not the absolute end, because the texts do not say that the spirits of the Nephilim, they claimed to be free from their bodies and wandering, with the Book of Enoch not giving them a destination before judgment. What Christian tradition calls demons, what rabbinic texts describe as unclean spirits, has one. They are not angels rebelling against God. They are Cain's children who died without a place to go in either realm. And if that is true, then the story that began with a mark on the forehead of a killer never really ended. I remain here, invisible and bodiless, waiting for what texts call the final judgment, though no date is known. The Bible we read gives us 4 verses about the Nephilim in Genesis 6, and then goes on to talk about the Ark and the Book of Enoch, preserved by the Ethiopian Church, offers complete chapters on a wide range of topics that others ignored. It tells us who the Watchers were by name, what they taught exactly, what they produced, and what remained after them. It tells us that Enoch was sent to communicate the divine sentence to those fallen angels, and that they wept upon hearing it. It tells us that the spirits of the Nephilim are the explanation for why the world after the flood remained full of evils. And it tells us that the entire process, from the Watchers to the giants, had deeper roots than Genesis. Roots that reach back to Cain, to Samael, to the very first moment when something foreign to creation entered into it all. That is the story that the texts tell when you read them all together, without ignoring those that Western tradition decided. A story where the first murderer in history was already a hybrid, and where his lineage prepared the ground for the angels. Where those angels produced giants that dominated the entire earth, and where the flood tried to erase everything without. Where the genes survived hidden inside the ark, where the giants reappeared, where Israel had to finish it. And where the spirits of that entire process remain here, according to the texts that the Western Bible chose not to include in its. This is not a story from thousands of years ago that ended and was filed away in some forgotten scroll in a monastery. According to the Book of Enoch, the last chapter of this story remains unwritten, as the final judgment has not yet happened. Cain was marked, his sons built civilizations, his descendants attracted the Watchers and the Nephilim. The flood covered the earth, the bodies died, but the souls of the giants remained free and aimless upon it. David killed the last of the great warriors of that lineage, but the spirits that remained did not die with the body. They remain here, as Enoch says, awaiting a judgment described as certain but not yet arrived. The final question that this story leaves open is not whether the Nephilim existed. The texts from multiple traditions. The question that remains is another, and it is one that the texts discarded by the Western Church dare to pose without. What happens to a world that still harbors the spirits of beings born from the crossing between the angelic and blood of? The Book of Enoch does not answer that question with evasions. It leaves it open, like a wound that only the final judgment can heal. And that is exactly the reason why the Ethiopian Church never abandoned that text, while the rest of the Christian world did. Because whoever reads the complete Book of Enoch understands that the biblical story we know is only half of what it is. The other half is in the retracted texts, in the silence traditions, and in the questions that almost no one dares to ask. There is a connection that scholars of these texts rarely point out, and it completely changes the reading of the entire work. If the line of Cain was designed from the beginning to attract the Watchers, then evil was not an accident of it. It was an infiltration planned from outside of creation, executed in 2 stages, with Cain as the first phase. And the first phase was silent, a hybrid that seemed human, living among humans, building like a human but not one. The second phase was brutal and visible giants of 300 cubits that could not be hidden because of their nature. But between those 2 phases, there were centuries of silent preparation, of a line that grew, that mixed, that waited without. And when the Watchers finally descended to Mount Hermon and swore together that forbidden pact, they found nothing. They found a civilization already built, with knowledge already accumulated, with women who already carried something in their blood. The ground was prepared since Genesis 4. The Watchers only needed to add the final ingredient to complete it. That ingredient was the direct angelic blood, which produced bodies that could not sustain their own existence. And when those bodies fell, when the flood swept them away, when the bones of the giants sank beneath the waters, what remained was nothing, neither peace nor silence. What remained were formless spirits searching for bodies that no longer existed. The Book of Enoch says that those spirits actively seek whom to inhabit, that they do not rest, that they have no assigned peace, and that their nature drives them to cause harm, not by conscious choice, but because that is the only thing their nature knows. This completely recontextualizes the way later biblical texts speak of possession and spirits. When the Gospels describe Jesus casting out spirits, the Book of Enoch provides a specific genealogy for them. They are not abstract entities of evil. They are the spiritual remnants of a genetic experiment that the flood could not contain. And if that genealogy is correct, then the spiritual war that the texts describe is not metaphorical. It has an origin. An origin that begins with Samael and Eve, continues with Cain and his mark, amplifies with the Watchers, and ends with them. Or more precisely, it doesn't end. It transforms, becomes invisible, disperses, and waits for the moment that the texts call it. All of this was written in texts that existed for centuries before the ecclesiastical councils decided what. The Book of Enoch was cited by authors of the New Testament. The letter of Jude cites it directly without any ambiguity. And yet he was excluded from the Western canon, preserved only by the Ethiopian church, kept in scrolls in Ge'ez. Until in 1773, a Scottish explorer named James Bruce brought 3 copies of Ethiopia and the Western world. What he found in those manuscripts was not mythology. It was a detailed narrative that filled in what Genesis left out. Names, dates, places, teachings, condemnations, spirits, genealogies, everything that Genesis compressed into 4. And at the center of all that expanded narrative was the same figure that Genesis briefly introduces and then seems to disappear. Cain, the marked one, the outcast, the founder of cities, the progenitor of Tubal-Cain, the silent origin of everything. The Bible presents him as a criminal who receives his punishment and disappears from history after Genesis 4, but not. His lineage remains there, in the text, in the genealogies, in the cities he built, in the knowledge that his children. And when the Watchers descend in Genesis 6, the reader who has followed both lines understands that it is not a new story. It is the continuation of a story that began in chapter 4, with a mark, with an exile, and with a question without. Why did God let Cain live? This question weaves through the narrative like an invisible thread, linking them all. The only answer that emerges from reading all the texts together is that Cain was necessary for the flood to have won. Without Cain, there's no hybrid line. Without it, the Watchers can't find the prepared ground. And without that, there is none. And without Nephilim, there is no flood, no Noah, no second chance for creation, no Israel, no David. There is none. The first murderer in history was not an accident of free will. It was the first link in a chain that runs through. A chain that goes from Genesis 4 to the giants of Canaan, from the giants of Canaan to David, from David to the judgment, and whose last links, according to the Book of Enoch, have still not been placed because the complete account has not yet been told. This is the story that the Ethiopian Bible preserved when the Western world decided it was too much to include in it. The story of how the first child born on earth carried in his blood something that should not have been there from the very beginning. The story of how that blood paved the way for the fallen angels, for the giants, for the flood, and for everything else. The story of what the flood couldn't fully erase remains, unseen, awaiting the closure offered by the texts. The mark of Cain was not just a sign of protection, it was the first seal of a nature that did not fit into creation, and that nature, once introduced into the world, followed its own path independent of any human will. The children of Cain did not choose to be different. They were born different, and that difference took them where it took them. Just as Cain did not ask to be conceived by Samael, the Nephilim did not ask to be the children of angels and women of hybrid blood. But her existence triggered consequences that none of them could control or foresee from the moment of her birth. The Book of Enoch describes that process with a precision that no other ancient text has matched in detail and scope. And he describes it not as a moral tragedy, but as a cosmic tragedy. Something went wrong in the very structure of it. When the Watchers descended, they not only broke a rule, they broke the separation between two orders of existence. That separation existed for a reason. Beings of the spiritual order and those of the material order could not mix without. The consequences were the Nephilim, beings that did not belong to either of the two orders and that destroyed everything in their path. The flood was not the wrath of God. It was the only way to restore a separation that the Watchers had broken without. But the separation was never fully restored because the seed of Cain traveled in the ark and the lineage continued. And that is perhaps the most disturbing truth of this whole story, that the original problem was never fully resolved. The biblical text closes its pages, but the book of Enoch leaves open a question that no ecclesiastical council could. Is that gap between the two orders closed, or is it still open, invisible, waiting to be recognized by someone who knows how to look? The texts do not provide a definitive answer to that question. They only say that the final judgment will close it when it arrives. And while that moment does not arrive, the story of Cain, the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the flood remains present. Not as mythology archived in scrolls, as a narrative that the texts preserved by Ethiopia never declared. Whoever wants to understand the Nephilim must start where the story truly begins, with the mark on Cain's forehead. Subscribe to continue exploring the texts that official history decided to silence, and that still have much to say.